Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 40. Have you ever noticed how easy it is to get sucked down a rabbit hole online? 1 minute you're scrolling through social media, the next you're knee-deep in the bizarre tradition of competitive cheese rolling. It can happen to anyone. But it's not always funny. Sometimes those rabbit holes can lead people to some pretty dark places. We're talking extreme ideologies, conspiracy theories, and the potential for radicalization. Perhaps most concerning, this phenomenon is having a significant impact on our youth. According to George Washington University research, there's been a significant rise, 413%, in cases where the internet played the primary role in the radicalization process between 2010 and 2020, coinciding with the proliferation of major social media platforms and Gen Z entering their teenage years. Here's former Assistant Attorney General for National Security, John P. Carlin.
Here we're seeing in over 50% of the criminal cases that we've brought, the defendants are 25 or younger, and in around a third of them, they are 21 or younger. That's particularly troubling for us because the criminal justice system is not a great tool for dealing with juveniles, and we prefer not to bring federal juvenile cases. So we need a way when it comes to those who are getting radicalized online. And what happens is they get the broad message, and then we're seeing designated terrorists having direct conversations with people, and it could be in the bedroom of your house, and the parents are not used to, they know who their kids' friends are in the school or in the real world, but they don't know who they're hanging out with online.
So what makes some people more susceptible to radicalization than others? And how can we prevent young people from falling prey to these dangerous online influences? That's what we're going to talk about on this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and in this episode, we're speaking with an expert on extremism and radicalization.
My name is Jack Wippell. I'm originally from the UK, but I'm now based in the US. I did my undergraduate and stuff in the UK, and then was working for kind of think tanks in the counter-radicalization space. And then I moved to the US to pursue a master's, finished that master's, stayed in the US, and I generally research themes along the stuff that I've worked on in think tanks and nonprofits in terms of far-right extremism, ideology, conspiracies, how they spread, the kind of mindsets that make young people especially vulnerable to that spread, and how we can intervene at different stages to help mitigate that spread.
Stick around to hear Jack explain the potential of social and emotional learning, SEL, to help young people develop the critical thinking skills and emotional intelligence they need to navigate the world safely. Jack Wippell, welcome to the show and thank you for making time.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's very exciting to be here.
So I'm not particularly informed about social and emotional learning, so we'll definitely dive into that. But so I'll have a couple questions along that line. But before we dive into the details there, I wanted to talk a little bit about this problem of radicalization or youth radicalization, and is this? Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. Like, how prevalent is it? Is this a new thing? Is it something we're just now starting to realize is there, or has this been happening for a while? And what do we know about how these youth come to hold these radical beliefs? If you can, if that's not too much in one.
Sure. I'll provide an answer, and then you can let me know if I miss anything. But in general, I would say, obviously, the big change for the modern world in terms of young people's access to radical ideologies is through the internet, right? So many people can now just log on to the mainstream social media like Facebook, Twitter, now X, all that kind of stuff. Or they can go into more radical forums like 4chan or even onto the dark web. And that's all easily accessible with some internet connection, as opposed to, 20 years ago when it was not that kind of international, if you like, in the sense you can connect with people wherever they are in the world who are spreading these beliefs. So youth radicalization, always an issue. It's been changing in the sense that before internet kind of stuff, it's much more like this local community level. Obviously, there's these countercultures like the skinheads, which develop some far-right extremist side of that, white nationalists, and they go explicitly to recruit young people, in person. They go outside schools. But now there's this scenario in which young people can be targeted just online, right? People can just put out YouTube videos and stuff like that, and algorithms even. There's been a lot of talk about kind of algorithmic radicalization, in which you're funneled down this rabbit hole of extremist beliefs. Young people will come to these videos, and those who are more susceptible will go down them. The susceptibility thing is obviously something that's not cut and dry. There's no clear one singular profile of people that go down these rabbit holes, but there are definitely features that are shared, and they're quite broad in the sense of their kind of psychological states. So, one really big one that's been talked about a lot is this concept of black and white thinking. People who kind of think in binaries, us versus them, good or evil. There's one solution to a problem versus many. They see that in other individuals and just in society more broadly. And if you're going onto these extremist narratives, watching them, though the way they speak about the world, that here is a simple solution that can encapsulate everything, it really appeals to those mindsets. The other element, of course, being more like societal factors or individual factors that are not psychological states, right? Like economic hardship or other stuff. And specific to youth, a big thing is the fact that they're going through these transitions, right? You're learning who you are. You don't have a clear identity. You're forming that. And these narratives that come in and kind of play on your innate insecurities, all that kind of stuff, appeal a lot. And it's very easy to gradually start moving through them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it seems like there's sort of and you may know more about this or have experienced this or looked into this in the work that you've done with your nonprofits and other areas. It seems like there's sort of a combination of sort of holistic, for lack of a better term, of just people that are really into it and then go promote it, and also sort of a very disinformation, intentional aspect of it too, where there seem to be bad actors that don't even really necessarily believe some of these things, but they kind of like the power trip or something about kind of driving people into it, and others. I think there's bad actors like some of our adversaries that have also shown they like to drive wedges into these things and into divisions we already have and things like that. But what are your thoughts about some of that?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think there's a nice analogy here to, in the kind of Civil War literature, there's this concept of conflict entrepreneurs. They're these people who benefit from the conflicts, who want to keep feeding them and keep them going. And here we have a similar thing where there are people who very much benefit to this polarization. We see this spread of conspiracies and all that kind of stuff. Trump being the obvious example, but many others, other podcasters, right, who benefit from the financial incentives from that side of stuff, and they hold a really important position. They offer these figureheads people can turn to, see as their source of information, get behind, elect in some cases, and they offer a validation to their beliefs, right? They're saying, these are the reasons for your problems. This is what's happening.
Right. And, as you were saying that when you were answering the prior question, I was really got thinking about, many of those attributes or characteristics you talk about, they are so prevalent when we're young. We're looking for that identity. We're looking for a place to, land, this kind of thing. Plus, we're susceptible in general to black and white thinking. That's pretty common as our brain develops. So it's like it just started, kind of the hair on the back of my neck are standing up as I'm hearing all those things, saying, that sort of fits with, sort of the teen angst and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, totally. And I think another kind of like fun, interesting fact that always has struck me is you get a lot of people who, well, first of all, the number of people who hold radical beliefs is much bigger than those who act violently on it. So there's always this difficulty. If it's like an iceberg, right, that you only see the top, that's really covered in the news. These lone actors that go and shoot up a school or go shoot a church and stuff like that. But the body of people that do believe something along these lines is huge in comparison. And from that, there's this very interesting element of, as you say, going through these transitions is really important. And there are often spikes in people, in the profiles of people who go out and commit extremist, ideologically motivated, targeted violence, are in the ages when it's very common to have some kind of like identity crisis, kind of midlife crisis. It is a very common age, late 30s, early 40s, or further down the line or earlier, these kind of big transition points. And we see a lot of the lone actors who are young, who catch the media attention, are kind of between these ages of like 17 and 19. They're not 6-year-olds, right? They've suddenly developed the capabilities to go purchase firearms, do all of this kind of stuff. And then combined with this identity turmoil, it's this horrible combination of factors that can produce really damaging results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, it seems like, and I think I try to be pretty even-handed on this podcast and not really try to take a lot of partisan views. But it seems like when we're talking about radicalization these days, and this could be a cycle, maybe it changes at different times, but it seems like it's much more common to be, right radicalization, or radicalization on the right, or right-leaning things. And I guess I check to see if I'm getting that right. And then B, how does that align with, it seems like a lot, and maybe I'm wrong on this one too, but it seems like when I've seen some studies on this that, the younger folks are tending to lean more left and be less likely to attach to the right. And maybe that's wrong. Maybe it's pretty even keeled. But and so I guess, how does that play into this? Is this does that still kind of all still fit that this is a growing concern, and are any of those things just flat wrong?
Oh, sure. I think, at least from my perspective, again, I could be wrong, but I see it as more a right-wing thing, right? But that's not to say it doesn't happen on the left. Like, there are people who espouse violence, who want to go commit violence from left-wing perspectives, and from others, right? It's not just like a left-right binary. There are other ideologies out there, and the obvious case being, Antifa groups, those kind of groups that in some cases want to go commit violence. I think a big issue has always been, these two opposing sides capture attention, and it's very easy for, say, right-wing figures to play off left-wing actors who do, say, one act of violence or something like that. Like, there's this media figure, Andy No, I don't know if you've heard of him, who's based in the Pacific Northwest. He's currently suing Rose City Antifa, who are based in the Portland area, and for defamation. And then there's a lot of other stuff, but it's very easy to target these left-wing radicals because they one of them was violent at a protest, something like that. And it's very easy to mobilize mass support of kind of people who may not otherwise side with you, because they see it visible, and they're like, oh, well, we don't like violence, so we're going to side with this group, and we're kind of willing to ignore some of the violence on this side. But by focusing on the other side, even if it's in the vast minority of cases, we have a justification for that. And I think a big part of it is kind of the natural inherent biases almost that people hold. For years and years and years, there's been discrimination against certain groups. Like, as you said, this black and white thinking is very common. The common way of speaking about it being in groups versus out groups. And these narratives appeal, especially when people are going through changes, or if there's economic downturns, COVID being a big one. People are struggling and they want easy solutions to stuff. You just need one easy focus point for that to be triggered.
Mm-hmm. Right. And we all kind of want a purpose in life and this kind of thing, and it can make you feel like you're special and that you've got a higher purpose kind of thing too. It kind of fits in with that narrative as well. So you were talking before about, that there's this, and I completely agree with this, that there's a lot of people that hold these views that aren't necessarily the ones out there committing violence. Now, I kind of wonder how far of a step is it to go from where they are to committing violence, but how are you defining radicalization then? If I hold, because it's you can still hold these views, but not necessarily, it doesn't always mean violence. So kind of how are you kind of defining what radicalization means?
Right. Yeah. I mean, and you're getting at one of the questions at the heart of this kind of literature, because it is such a difficult term to define. There's so many different elements, especially when we're talking about concepts like the far right. Typically those views are far in the sense that a minority hold them. But in this day and age, with the polarization, so many people hold some resemblance of those ideas. I think in general, I would ascribe to a nice distinction, I think, in the radicalization literature between these concepts of like cognitive radicalization versus behavioral. So there are people who will radicalize and believe these things, but they'll never go and act on them. And there are people who will radicalize and believe these things, and they'll radicalize in terms of action and want to go and commit violence based on those actions. That's like one of the points I try to get through in the article, actually, is about how, this propensity to want to commit violence, to, as they say, have a deviant behavior. The traits for those people is pretty similar to those that would go and commit ideological violence. It's the difference being that they have an ideology behind it, but often people who go commit ideological violence have prior criminal offenses registered, even if very minor. So that's one element, that kind of distinction between ideas versus action. I think then broadly, radicalization is going to be the process of people taking up extreme political beliefs that kind of, I guess, undermine the status quo and perhaps undermine existing systems. So being anti-democratic, kind of minority rule, if you like. I believe this is right. Of course, this is getting into a whole other issue of what counts as extreme. I think in almost a circular sense, if one is supporting, if one sees legitimate non-democratic means, say violence, to achieve your aims, I would call that extreme. I think that's a pretty extreme idea. But then, you look back in time against people fighting for civil rights. Obviously, what is the status quo is really determined in age, and it is a difficult topic to define. I think the point, though, has recently become more interesting in the who is the radical, especially after January 6th, with the types of people that were turning out. In the sense, it was not. I think a phrase that was circulating was, "It's not your grandfather's radical." It's not like young white skinheads turning up to break some stuff. It was like middle-aged America from suburbia who traveled en masse to storm the Capitol. It's this different world we're living in, and defining radicalization in that sense becomes more challenging when we're considering how many people hold at least some semblance of the view. And of course, distinctions with conspiracy theories, right? Like, is everyone who holds a conspiracy theory a radical? Yes, no, probably not in my view. But there are so many elements that combine here.
Right, and going beyond the youth radicalization, I mean, with what I've sort of learned in this journey so far on this podcast is, we've got the dehumanization aspect seems like that leads you down that road to where, in your moral stance seems to sort of keep moving of what do you consider moral, because the other side just keeps getting, sort of more and more of a moral existential threat. And so you're willing to do democratic backsliding in these things because you perceive them as such a threat and so immoral and so evil. And, that's something that is pretty prevalent beyond, and again, you still draw that line. When is it radical? And I do these, what I call these street outrage interviews, where I talk to sort of ordinary folks. I just kind of listen to what they're saying. I don't try to push back or try to convince them of anything. And, it's amazing how people hold what, would I think independent observers would consider pretty extreme views, and yet they still consider themselves moderate. And in fact, even, we did a show where someone interviewed, where a sort of a gonzo journalist was there at January 6th and interviewed the people there. And the things folks said in those interviews, you say, this is just like Uncle Bill there, he's just sort of a regular guy. But this ability to hold at the same time, attack the police, break in, smash windows, do all these things, and then say, but we're the peaceful ones, and actually sort of resolve that, as saying, yeah, we're the peaceful ones. We don't do violence, but you just did, right now you're doing it. And that's just an extreme example, but we all hold these blind spots where we consider ourselves, kind of moderate, no matter where we are in the spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think it's an age-old issue that I'm not sure there'll ever be a solution to. And I think it's reflected in interventions that are going on in the sense, again, my work in the Pacific Northwest was very much like ideology neutral, I guess, that the focus was, okay, we prevent violence, right? Any group, any ideology that's espousing violence. Now, there are radical ideologies we can target. Like, obviously, if you're saying white people are better than others, that's an ideology we want to prevent because that can lead down the road to violence. But in the sense, anyone that says, okay, my views are justified, therefore they justify violence, the intervention comes there. And I think that's been a move by quite a few things, just given the difficulty of the scenario that we find ourselves in.
Yeah. Well, let's switch to talking a little bit about what social and emotional learning is, or SEL. I think is that how it's normally, you just use the acronym SEL?
Yeah, I mean, either works.
And how is it? So I guess, how can it be helpful? And questions like, what does it actually look like in a classroom, and sort of what age range are we talking about?
Sure. I mean, I think, well, I'll start at the end, I guess. I think age range, it can go well beyond schools. I think I focus on young people in schools because that's an area of particular interest for me, and an area where SEL programs are implemented, right? Like, people are in the classroom, they go through these learnings in some states, at least. There's been some backlash. So I think everyone can benefit from these things. But broadly, it's the idea is promoting these kind of cognitive, psychological elements that help people thrive, that help develop their own skills, their independence. So kind of the big five, if you like, defined by this collaborative for academic, social, and emotional learning, which is one of the main companies in the area, is self-awareness, social awareness, self-management, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making, right? Like, none of those are specific to any political leaning, but there are all these things that help people kind of engage with others from different backgrounds, that reconcile their own identity, deal with the uncertainty that's going on in a way that's positive, rather than, oh, there's this uncertainty, therefore I'll blame these people. And this kind of process it maps very nicely onto issues of why people hold radical beliefs or go and act in them. Say, like, there's this really nice concept, integrative complexity, which has been found to be higher in non-radicals, lower in radicals, which is like broadly defined as the ability to, one, recognize that there are different views on a topic, and then two, integrate those into forming your own belief. Now, that's very difficult to do if you think the other side's just wrong and there's no reconciling, because then you hold your belief, you're never going to change it. But if you're able to recognize, it's almost empathy, right? It's like these people have their own beliefs for their own reasons. How can I take the kind of good that I see there, merge it with my own beliefs, and form new ones? And SEL essentially helps with these processes of you working as an independent being in a society, and engaging with other human beings. And it's originally in the education space. It's got positive results for education performance, right? Which is the interesting element. People who have more self-awareness, more relationship skills, do better on kind of math tests, those kind of things. And obviously that's changing a lot, right? There are always new interventions. One thing about SEL is there's loads of different types of what is focused on. Like, there are some programs which are very, a big part of SEL historically was preventing violence in young people. Not necessarily ideological violence, just violence more generally, or bullying and that kind of stuff. So there are some that focus kind of explicitly on that. There are others that focus much more on academic performance, but all share this process of this idea that by improving the cognitive processing abilities of people that can improve their outcomes in other areas of life.
Mm-hmm. And would you see, if SEL were to be sort of applied to youth radicalization, and would you see that being like an explicit discussion area, or how would it be more about kind of just teaching better awareness about disinformation and some of the techniques used, or how do you see that playing out in real life?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are big elements. I think part of the point of my piece, if you like, was saying that there's a lot of good stuff already there that I think kind of cross applies to radicalization. I think recognizing that can almost help encourage people to implement these programs. But on the other side of stuff, there are like kind of tinkering that I think would be important for these programs to better reflect the world of radicalization. I think online media literacy is a big one. Kind of post-COVID, there's been a lot more interest in that from SEL researchers and implementers because of the force that everyone had to go online. But I think finding ways to deal with the kind of information people come across online and the people that are posting is so important. It's much easier to write horrible things about someone who's far, far away on an online account than say it to someone's face. Like, that's always been true. But trying to increase levels of recognition that these are also people, these are people we're engaging with, is a big part in that. The other side is this misinformation, disinformation, recognizing what is true and what is not, which people have kind of an agenda, which don't. And I think SEL can, like, perhaps with some adaptation, help here, recognizing, well, that other people exist and have their own views. You can recognize that other people also have their own agendas in the stuff they're spreading, and how you take in this information and form your beliefs is really important. And one point I do mention in the article is that there are these new kind of interactive tools that social psychologists are developing to help all people better recognize disinformation and misinformation. But one kind of key element, at least in my mind, is they're much more. They're developing these tools that are in like app format, which are much easier. There are games, play and find out what is misinformation, all this kind of stuff. And there's a really good book called Foolproof that came out recently, and it's paired with an app, which is one you can go try this out. But I think stuff like that is so important because that's like an engaging way young people could actually go do this stuff. Like, it's one thing to just say teachers in the classroom, but it's another to actually get people to ascribe to it and want to employ it in their day-to-day lives. So there's going to be kind of a broadening of the net of what's covered, a recognition that this is a valid area that can be helped, and also some more creativity in getting people to actually take this on board and employ it day to day.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, we hear a lot about sort of bringing civics education or improving civics education in schools, and that's great. I'm all for that. But, we don't hear people, very seldom do you hear anybody say, hey, we have to really get some kind of a baseline, psychology. We hear media literacy and all these other things. It's almost like, I feel like, and this is something that people talk to me, people that talked to me when I was 25 heard me saying this, I think it would lost my mind or something. But this idea of kind of a psychology literacy, at least a baseline of some idea, because it seems like we have huge blind spots to these things, and we always think we're the ones that are sort of being rational and logical, but it's pretty easy to see, especially as an outside observer, that we're all susceptible to these same things. Now, is this so? How does that kind of, what you have thoughts on that, and how does that kind of play into SEL?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're totally right in that sense. I think it's an area that's so important, but it's just not often mentioned. I know. So in the UK context, I don't think psychology is even a course you can take till you're 16. So that's much later down the line, and before we have this. I can't remember the exact acronym. We have something that's trying to get at kind of self-awareness and that stuff. PSHE, but it's never been. I don't know what that stands for. So but it's always been so fluid and never like specific in the sense of this is this and this is how you can apply it, or this is why people think this way. And that's always like a difficulty, right? That I think like kids are perfectly capable of understanding and can be introduced much earlier on. I think SEL definitely gets to that partly. one of the focal areas being like responsible decision making. Like it's a good place to learn about how people make decisions and how do you use information to act and all that kind of stuff that there's just so relevant to psychology. I guess I think the links are pretty close and could be worked in. I mean, I do totally agree with you that I think there's all these words floating around like media literacy, all that stuff, paired with the fact that, as I've said, SEL, there are a lot of different programs. It's not really like one approach. It is difficult to narrow down like what does it actually mean? What does it entail? And I think that's part of an ongoing dialogue, which we need to, work out and honestly try and overlap them all a bit. Media literacy, SEL, and help just generally foster positive mindsets that can deal with the uncertainties of the world and more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess I'd like to finish on like sort of what's your sort of scale, or are you optimistic about this? Are you pessimistic? Are you worried? Or both?
I think both. I think it's there are a lot of really good programs out there. I think there's a lot of thought being put into this, and it's increasingly being recognized as a place where there is risk, and that non-punitive measures are going to be often better options. I mean, one really big case again in the UK was this prevent strategy in schools where teachers were required to refer people they thought could be extremists or radicalizing, and that was just so ineffective because people would just harness their bias, if you like, and just report people who were doing normal things. There was a case of a PhD student studying terrorism who ordered a terrorism book and was reported to the police because of that. So there are shifting to this more positive framework is being recognized and being acted on. So that is good. I think there is a huge difficulty in the US in the way SEL has been talked about. Like critical race theory, just totally hated by a lot of people. And SEL is increasingly being lumped into that. There have been TikToks going around of people getting angry that teachers are teaching their kids empathy, right? Like it's very confusing, this whole world we find ourselves in where suddenly empathy is a bad quality. But so there is a lot of state backlash. Like Florida is a big case where, though SEL programs are being implemented in some ways, they can't be called that, and they can't be part of like a holistic enterprise to try and promote those qualities because they're seen as evil left-wing agendas. And I think it's just going to take a hell of a lot of work to work out how to go around that, given that you have so many elites and high-level figures just constantly blaming this. This is the woke agenda, this is SEL, this is corrupting your children. Such an easy thing to play on to garner mass support. But on that side, so much work is needed. I think there is scope to do it, but I think just navigating those waters at this time is so challenging.
Right. I mean, everything, people are like just itching for a left-right fight and look at everything in that lens.
Right. Totally.
Yeah, that's a big issue we have before us to try to resolve. But I guess one person at a time kind of thing is one place to start.
Oh, totally. And I think one added element to this is what an increasing thing that people are looking at in radicalization studies and terrorism is this concept of like contagion. If you're around people that hold radical beliefs, you're more likely to uptake them, and they can spread pretty quickly, especially with the help of online. And that's been a kind of prevention method, is now preventing the contagion. But at the same level, I think there is like maybe there's a way to make a kind of contagion on the SEL side. If you're engaging with people that show you empathy, that show you that they're validating your beliefs and helping you go through them, and kind of really listening to you, those are important qualities that hopefully you can then learn and replicate. And there is an element that if we can just start getting this through to some people, it might spread much more broadly. And obviously kids growing up being in families, they could talk to their parents about this, and maybe this is, well, spreading the woke agenda, I guess now, but in my view, a positive thing that is not specific to any one belief or ideology. It's more so just how do we engage with other people around us?
Right, exactly. Right. And that itself can, like, people are expecting that to be, some kind of a left-right battle or something like that. And, and I noticed this in my street outrage interviews that after a little while, when I don't push back or I don't start arguing with them about something or I don't have a strange reactions, it's like they're almost shocked about this. Like, this has never happened before kind of thing almost, It's like, it's so, because everybody's just, typically that doesn't happen. You have a quick reaction, plus it's their experiences. They're kind of expecting it. They're like, they're already on edge a little bit. So they're kind of expecting there to be this pushback in this fight. Yeah, it's like, I think, we have to almost flip that coin around to say, it's like, make the expectation be that there isn't going to be a fight.
I think that's exactly it. I think that's very well said.
Yeah. All right. Well, great. I really appreciate you making time to come on the show. I enjoyed chatting with you, Jack Wippell.
Great. Well, it was a pleasure talking to you.
Pleasure talking to you. Thanks again.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And that is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you enjoyed this episode, if you found it interesting, please tell some friends about it. Post it to your social media. Better yet, text someone. Even better, talk to someone in real life. Tell them about this show. I really appreciate it. Okay, see you in a week or two.